From 1948 to 1949, the Berlin blockade took place. This blockade and the ensuing Berlin airlift, which was carried out by the United States, was a huge morale booster throughout Europe and throughout the West in general. In this video, I would like to talk about the origins of this blockade, why it happened, and also the impact that it had on Europe and the West in general. In 1945, the Russians had chased the Germans back to Berlin, and the Allies basically came to an agreement that the West and East would be split. The West would be controlled by the Allies, the Western Allies, and the East would be controlled by the Russians or the Soviets. Within East Germany, the city of Berlin was also split between West and East. This was quite an awkward predicament for the Western Allies, as they were basically in the middle of enemy territory. The Allies had decided far back in 1944, in the London Protocol, they had signed an agreement that basically said that Germany would be split into 3 separate areas. Of course, this kind of shifted throughout the years, but that sort of agreement to split Germany was always there from the very end of World War II. This was further reiterated in 1945 with the Potsdam Agreement, where the Allies basically came together and decided how Germany would be precisely split between the Western Allies and the Soviets. On the 15th of December 1947, the 4 big powers, United States, Soviet Union, France and United Kingdom, had a conference in London called the Foreign Secretary Conference, where they basically debated to each other about the future of Germany. These meetings were unsuccessful and didn't lead to much decisions about the future of Germany. But with this meeting, it was quite clear that the Western Allies were very determined for the establishment of a democratic government in West Germany. This was something that they really wanted. They didn't want to directly control West Germany. They wanted West Germany to have its own government and for, of course, it to be democratic and Western orientated. In February 1948, Czechoslovakia fell to communism, and the pressure was kind of on because the Cold War was really in swing now, and there was a fear of communism and communist takeover in West Germany. So they really wanted to establish a democratic government in West Germany. And so throughout the early part of 1948, the London Six-Power Conference occurred, and this actually excluded the Soviet Union, which was quite a sneaky move at the time. And this was basically discussions about the future of West Germany and the establishment of this democratic government. The Soviets actually responded to these meetings by stopping British and American trains on their way to Berlin. So it's clear that they did not condone these meetings taking place without their permission. This was around the time when the Marshall Plan was being set in gear, which was economic aid by the United States towards European countries in return for American businesses being allowed to invest in these economies, and also these European nations buying products and services from the United States. On the 7th of March 1948, the West basically agrees to extend this Marshall Plan to Germany, and they also agreed, crucially, on the establishment of a federal government in Western Germany. This kind of enraged Stalin, who tried to restrict Western access to Berlin. And so the Soviets were kind of checking every train, and actually trains couldn't leave Berlin without Soviet permission from a Soviet commander. In response to this, the United States started to actually fly their supplies into their military garrison in West Berlin. On the 5th of April, a British plane and a Soviet plane actually collided with each other, which kind of exacerbated tensions between the two nations and between the West and the East. On the 21st of June, the Deutsche Mark was introduced by the Americans, British and French into Germany, and it became widely popular throughout all 4 sectors of Berlin, which included the eastern sector of Berlin. And this obviously enraged Stalin. This was kind of the last straw for Stalin, because he really wanted the West to leave Berlin completely. He wanted the entire city for himself. In the following days, Stalin basically restricted all access to West Berlin. Now for the West, there was no way in and out other than in the air. Something that isn't really talked about is the counter-blockade that the West had on East Germany. And this actually had a huge industrial and economic impact on the development of East Germany. On the 25th of June, the Soviet Union stopped supplying any food to the civilian populations of West Germany. The situation had now kind of exasperated hugely, because West Berlin only had 36 days worth of food left and 45 days worth of coal. If action wasn't taken really soon, then West Berlin would simply starve to death. And before you think that Stalin wouldn't have let this happen, we know that he did in many cases before with Holodomor. In West Berlin, there were 2 United States regiments, and these wouldn't have been able to do much against the Soviets, who would basically surround the city with their military. The United States did send in some planes, but It's kind of obvious to the Soviets that these weren't capable of carrying atomic bombs, which was kind of the threat that the United States was trying to put out there. So in other words, the military situation was not looking good for the West. There were different opinions on how to deal with this situation. General Curtis LeMay, who was the United States Air Force commander of Europe, he basically said that we should just attack East Berlin, attack East Germany, start World War III. But the United States did not think this was a good idea, of course. It would lead to, a World War III, so it wasn't a good idea. At the same time, the United States did not want to give up West Berlin. It was basically symbolic of America's intent on the world stage to protect its interests throughout the world. They didn't want to give up and concede to the Soviet Union in any way. And so it was decided to carry out an airlift in Berlin to ship in supplies and food and basically everything in West Berlin would need. And so British and American planes flew in and out of West Berlin at huge speeds, huge amount of planes, huge amount of supplies, and it was very successful. Militarily, the Soviet response was pretty much to do nothing. There's nothing they really could do without starting World War III. The Soviets did try to carry out a coup in West Berlin, but this was obviously very unsuccessful. Almost a year later, on the 12th of May 1949, the Soviets announced an end to the blockade. This entire thing was a huge morale booster for the West in general, and it was also a huge propaganda tool that the United States could use to basically show that they were the heroes of the world. They were the good guys. It's this sort of attitude that led to the Korean War and then to, of course, the Vietnam War, which we don't really want to talk about in this episode. But it kind of led to that mindset that they were the good guys and the other team, which was the Soviet Union, they were the bad guys. Because obviously if they had helped the starving citizens of West Berlin and basically prevented them from starvation, of course they're the good guys, right? So this was definitely a great, propaganda tool for the United States. During the airlift, one plane entered West Berlin every 30 seconds, which is kind of insane to think about. In total, the American and British Air Forces supplied over 2 million tons of supplies into West Berlin, which most of that was coal, of course. And so ultimately, this blockade and this airlift had ultimately led to a victory for the West over the Soviets. And in American history, you don't really see the American government making great decisions all the time. But I do think this one situation was honestly an amazing decision from the United States to come in and basically help the German citizens in their time of need. And of course, it was a huge morale booster throughout the West because they basically had their first major victory against the communists. This was an era when communism was actually growing throughout the world and it seemed to be spreading. And finally, in the early days, the United States had shown a victory over the communists. So that is pretty much the end of the video. If you liked it, please consider subscribing. And thank you for watching.